Let them praises give Jehovah. They were made at His command. Them forever He established. His decree shall never stand. From the earth, oh, praise Jehovah. All ye floods, ye dragons all. Fire and hail and snow and vapors, stormy winds that hear Him call. Let them praises give Jehovah, for His name alone is high. And His glory is exalted. And His glory is exalted. And His glory is exalted, far above the earth and sky.
I want to start off by giving you a whole litany of excuses before I start. First of all, we're way down the bench when it comes to me teaching here. Charles has done a pretty amazing job with what he's presented to us. And Jerry was going to teach for him today. Charles is out preaching somewhere, and Jerry was going to teach, and Jerry is not doing well. And so he asked me if I would do this, and I said, "You mean come up with something on my own for a week?" He goes, "No, we've got it here." And I go, "Whoa." I have looked at Revelation before. I've even taught Revelation before. However, I've been familiar with the preterist view of Revelation, but I have never studied it ever until this class. So I'm kind of learning week by week, as some of y'all are, as far as how that view of Revelation comes together. What I had learned and taught before is a progressive parallelism of Revelation, which is Revelation shows basically the history of man and certainly the Christian era 7 times over from the beginning to the end, and it fits any time of history. So this is part of history, so it works with this AD 70 as well, but it also works with every other part of history, and that's, when man does bad, he is punished, and God is the victor in the end, and that's kind of the overall story several times it goes through the book of Revelation. As you bring it down to AD 70 and looking at this preterist view, that has been somewhat new to me, and like when I look at chapter 8 where we are in Revelation, I see, you got the trumpets, and Charles brought out some of the similarities between what's going on here and the plagues. We're talking about darkness and locusts and so forth, and some of the similarities between the plagues and what's going on here. Talks about the trumpets, and we're now at the 7th seal where the 7 trumpets are blown, and you've got the number 7 over and over and over, which is the complete, perfect number, showing completeness. And Charles has talked plenty about the numbers. But trumpets have often been a warning sign. Here comes the trumpet, get ready for battle, or whatever it is. And that's kind of what I had thought of the trumpets. We're looking more at a specific reason with AD 70, and so that's kind of where we are. Let's take a look. If somebody will read just to get our minds back into things, chapter 8. Revelation chapter 8, let's read verses 6 through 11, and that's kind of where we are.
Then the 7 angels with the 7 trumpets prepared to blow their mighty blasts. The first angel blew its trumpet, and hail and fire mixed with blood were thrown down on the earth. 1/3 of the earth was set on fire, 1/3 of the trees were burned, and all the green grass was burned. Then the second angel blew his trumpet, and a great mountain of fire was thrown into the sea. 1/3 of the water in the sea became blood, 1/3 of all things living in the sea died, and 1/3 of all the ships on the sea were destroyed. Then the third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from the sky, burning like a torch. It fell on 1/3 of the rivers and on the springs of the water. The name of the star was Bitterness. It made 1/3 of the water bitter, and many people died from drinking the bitter water.
Okay, as you can see that, it's talking about third of the earth was burned up, trees burned up, fire mixed with blood, and again some of those visions back to the plagues in Exodus, about Exodus chapter 7, some of the similarities there. Well, I get ready to teach, and we were up to page 9 in this first handout we had from chapter 8, and I don't have any of the other older handouts, but about 3/4 of the way down the page, on page 9, it says, see excursus, Roman-Jewish alliance in chapter 8, verses 10 and 11 for further historical perspective. I was in big trouble. I had no idea what excursus even meant. So I looked it up, and fortunately it's not too difficult. It's a detail of a specific point. And so we're going to look a little bit more into detail of some of these verses right here, specifically verses 10 and 11. But let's take a look at some of the historical things that pertain to the preterist view of Revelation, and kind of why this is all coming to a head here in AD 70. So, like we mentioned, the plagues in chapter 8, verse 8, toward the end, it says something like a huge mountain. If we look back in the Old Testament, and a lot of this stuff has references and ties back to the Old Testament, because God's plan had been from very early on kind of what's going to be going on, and things often tie in together. But in Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Micah, several times, talking about kingdoms, he called them mountains. And so, as we're looking at this, and it talks about a mountain being on fire and ablaze and thrown into the sea, it is a destruction of a nation or of a kingdom. And Isaiah 2 and 3, Jeremiah 51:25, Micah 4:1 and 2, and then chapter 6, 1 and 2. All of those talk about the mountain. The nation of Israel is God's holy mountain. Jerusalem known as Mount Zion. So we see several times through the Old Testament countries, nations, kingdoms being referred to as mountains. And so that's kind of what we're looking at here as we're looking at the nation of Israel about to come to their destruction here in AD 70. God used that imagery when He rendered judgment upon nations. I will repay Babylon and all the inhabitants of Chaldea before your very eyes for the evil that they have done in Zion, declares the Lord. Behold, I am against you, O destroying mountain, declares the Lord, which destroys the whole earth. I will stretch out my hand against you and roll you down from crags and make you a burnt mountain, from Jeremiah that we talked about. It's all ablaze and it's thrown into the sea. So we're about to see God's judgment exercised on Israel. And that's kind of what these verses are starting to talk about. The next part... Yep.
On the trumpets, we have a division. You'll see that the first 4 trumpets, the destructions happened with heavenly or
earthly stuff, the first 4.
earthly.
The next 3 are the spiritual ones.
And then the following was directly on mankind.
Spiritual things. Are you talking about the first four?
No, the next three.
Okay.
Used. I don't know how to say it. I don't know what the words are, but
There's spiritual consequences on the last three. The first one are everybody is going to, bad things happen to everybody. Well, and again, let's get back to the preterist view here that he's talking about, which is less to do with that.
right, yeah.
So, in verse 10, says, the third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on springs of waters. Most of this lesson today is going to be about that word star. In the Old Testament, stars sometimes spoke of nations, rulers, and authorities. In his fourth oracle, Balaam heard the word of God and declared a messianic prophecy regarding the nation of Israel. He said, there shall come a star out of Jacob. That's Numbers 24. And on down here in page 2 of today's handout, you see several times where the word star is used, all the way up into Matthew chapter 2, verse 2, where it talks about the star that rose, that the Magi saw, that they followed a star to find Jesus. Isaiah used the terminology in his prophecy against the king of Babylon. How have you fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn? How are you cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low? And again, through these prophets, Isaiah, Ezekiel, the thought or vision of a star being somebody that's cast down or lifted up or whatever is often referred to concerning nations, rulers, and authorities. In this particular passage, what the preterist view thinks of is the star is talking about the high priests. And that's kind of where we're going to focus our attention on, is the problem with the high priest and how that led to what happened in AD 70. Who is the first of that? Let's go back and take a little history lesson. In fact, a lot of this class now is going to be a history on the high priest. Who was the first high priest? Y'all remember? Aaron. Back in, I think it was Exodus 28, maybe. Aaron was named as a high priest. So let's go back a little bit farther than that. High priest came from what tribe? Nope. Levites. Yeah, the Levites. The Levites were not given a section of land when the land was divided up between the 12 tribes. Levites didn't get one, but their job was to take care of the tabernacle and to be the priest. Now Levi, who was the son of Jacob, one of the 12 sons, had 3 sons of his own. One of the sons was Kuhath, I think, Kuhath, Kuhath, maybe something like that. Anyway, he was then the father of Amram. And you remember Amram and Jochebed were the parents of Moses. Amram then had Moses, Aaron, and Miriam were his children. And so Moses and Amram were grandsons, or maybe great-grandsons of Levi. So the timeline there shows you a little bit how that came to being. Aaron was made then the first high priest, and says, you and your sons take care of the high priest duties, which were to, and I got to reading the book of Leviticus, which is pretty interesting actually, because I never read it. But Leviticus talks about God is holy, people are not holy, and we've got to find a way to come together. And that's what the high priests were there for, to connect God to the people. And so that's what Aaron's job was. Well, Aaron was not particularly good. Y'all remember what Aaron did when Moses went up on the mountain? Golden calf. I mean, he's the one in charge of doing all this stuff, and here he is. His next 2 sons, the next story we have about high priest, Nadab and Abihu, what did they do? They did, the foreign fire, and boom, they're gone. And I'm thinking, this is not a very good start to this high priest system. Now, you go back into Genesis, there's another high priest who Melchizedek, and that's a whole other story. We won't go down that rabbit hole right now. That's a pretty cool story as well. Anyway, so we've got the high priest coming from Levi down through Kohath, and it becomes through that Kohath, because not all Levites were priests. Now, all priests were Levites, but not all Levites were priests. However, the rest of them had other jobs in the temple and to do with the temple. Some of them taking care of it. Some of them lighting the fire. Some of them, all kinds of different things people had to do to take care of the temple. And then this one strand here through Kohath and then down through Aaron were the priests. That goes down, and we got other stories about the high priest with Eli and of course his sons and the problems they had. I think Samuel, if I'm not mistaken, was a Levi, maybe the only of the prophets that was a Levi. Anyway, that's kind of how it's set up, and it went from father to son, and it stayed in this lineage of Aaron as we're coming down. However, in 63 BC, General Pompey captures Jerusalem. The Roman Empire is starting to build up, and in 63 BC, General Pompey comes in and he takes Jerusalem. And they appointed ethnarchs, which were ethnic rulers in these places that they were capturing and taking over, and that's what they did in Israel. And the ethnarch that they put in Israel, in Jerusalem area, was then responsible for picking the high priest. And so now the high priest goes from the family of Aaron to whoever this guy picked, and now it's somewhat of a political appointee, and that's one of the problems here as we're seeing the falling apart of the high priest system. And some people think Annas was a Levite, some don't. Whether he was or not, he was a political appointee. In about 40 BC to 4 BC, the ethnarch that was put in place by the Romans, the guy that's going to be in charge of this area of Israel, was Herod the Great. And we've mostly heard of Herod the Great. I love history. Most of the history I get from TV. There aren't very many TV shows about Herod the Great, unfortunately, so I don't know much about him. But it's interesting as I read about him a little bit, and he was very paranoid. Herod the Great was always looking over his shoulder, to the point that he killed wives, sons, children, enemies. If he thought somebody was a political threat, he killed them. And he killed a bunch of them. And hence, when the Magi come and say, we're coming to worship this new king, what did Herod do? We're going to start killing anybody 2 years old and younger, they're out. Hence, we get the birth time of Jesus sometime before this 4 BC, because that's when Herod the Great died. When Herod the Great died, Joseph and Mary had taken off to Egypt. When Herod died, they thought it fine to come back and went back to Nazareth. So, yeah.
Specify Levi, the tribe of Levi, to be a high priest.
The priest, I believe, is in Exodus chapter 7, maybe. But I'd have to look. In Exodus. Anyway, Herod the Great had 3 sons that survived, and he divided up his kingdom to these 3 sons. The first one was Herod Antipas. Herod Archelaus was in charge of Judah, southern Judah area around Jerusalem. Herod Antipas was in charge of up there around Galilee. And the third son, Philip Tetrarch, was north and east of the Jordan. And so those three guys kind of had this kingdom divided up, starting in 4 BC to about 6 AD was when Herod Archelaus was in charge of the Judah area. Archelaus was not popular with the Jews, and because of that, after these 10 years that he was in charge, the Romans kind of booted him out, and Judah became under direct authority of the Romans at that time. In AD 6, a Roman named Quirinius appointed Annas as the first high priest of the Roman province of Judah. So Annas was put in place as the high priest by Quirinius, a delegate, a ruler from the Roman government. That's how Annas gets there. Now we're going to see Annas' name all through the Gospels and into Acts quite a bit. Trouble is, Annas wasn't that popular with some people either. Josephus, I don't know how many of y'all have ever read Josephus's works. It's a big old thick book. I've got it and have not read very much of it. However, he talks a lot about this area and this time and so forth. In fact, we'll read some more of that, what Josephus said about the war of the Jews here in a little bit. But in AD 15, Tiberius, who was the third emperor of, like the line of succession of the Caesars, Tiberius was the third one. He sent Valerius Gratus to be the procurator of Judah. So Gratus is going to be the boss down there in Judah, kind of a predecessor to Pilate that we're all more familiar with. Gratus did not like Annas, so he booted him and he appointed Ismail. Ismail, I think, was a son. I'm not sure if he was a son or not of Annas, but Gratus put Ismail in. Well, Ismail didn't last very long at all. It just says soon Ismail was booted, Eleazar was put in. Eleazar was a son of Annas. 1 year later, Eleazar is booted and he brings in Simon. About another year after that, Simon's booted and Joseph Caiaphas was appointed by Gratus. So in the period of just 2 or 3 years, it goes from Annas to Ismail to Eleazar to Simon to Caiaphas. So 5 different guys in a matter of a couple of years as appointed high priest in the area of Judah. Caiaphas was a son-in-law of Annas. And Annas is sometimes in the New Testament referred to as the high priest. He was really an exiled high priest because most of the time of Jesus' adult life, Caiaphas was the high priest. And we see their names almost interchangeably, and we'll take a look maybe at a couple of passages, especially I think let's take a look if I can find it. Acts chapter 6, I believe. Well, I may be wrong. It's 6, 7, 8, somewhere in there where Peter, I think Peter and John healed a blind man, and he was able to see, and the people said, "Oh, he can see." And it says Annas and Caiaphas, the high priest, didn't like it, and they set out to go against what Peter was doing. The point I want to bring into all of this history lesson, though, is this high priest was now a very political position, and they like many politicians, they wanted the power, and they had to be able to smooth things over with Rome. And so they were kind of buddies with Rome, and they did what the Romans wanted them to do very frequently. This family, Caiaphas' family, which went back to his father-in-law Annas and on down, they pretty much ruled this for most of the first century. They ruled the high priest position. Somebody in that family was high priest at that political appointee. Caiaphas was about 18 years the high priest, which was AD 18 to AD 36. That was most of Jesus' adult life. So that's the one we read about frequently in the New Testament. And when we get to talking about Jesus' crucifixion and he's being slung around, he went in front of Pilate, he went in front of Herod, he went in front of Caiaphas. All of these guys trying to find something that Jesus had done to be able to put him to death. During that time, too, though, the other point I wanted to make is Annas was very influential. He was one pulling the strings, even likely with Caiaphas. And then in AD 36, Pilate, who was the Roman in charge of that area, AD 36, Pilate and Caiaphas were booted out, and things moved on from there. By that time, we're into the book of Acts generally, and as far as New Testament stuff goes. Any questions on how that came about and anything to add? Some of y'all are much more historically educated than I am, but that's kind of what I came up with as far as this high priest deal.
Is there any indication that all those guys were booted because they weren't doing the bidding of the ruler at the time? I mean,
well, they were all at the whim of whoever their chain of command was up towards Caesar. And when somebody, you cross somebody, they booted you, and you're lucky probably if you stayed alive.
It seems to me most of the Roman ruling like that was very capricious.
Yes,
You just
absolutely.
walked on eggshells under your
Yeah. And we get on down to Nero, who is unbelievable how bad of a person that guy was. And he was only like 17 when he took over, and he was dead as a very young person. Some teenage punk running things that I wished I knew more about Nero, because it's fascinating to me at how somebody that bad can be in charge of so much at such a young age. Anyway, so Gentry, I'm on page 3 now of that handout that I gave. Gentry views the falling star of chapter 8, verse 10 as the powerful office of the Jewish high priest. So some people are equating this verse here in Revelation chapter 8, where it mentions the star, as being this high priest. That's why we went down that little rabbit hole about who the high priests were, where they came from, what their job was, and how it had disintegrated from being the mediator between God and man to a political appointee who, well, what did Jesus do in this last week of his life? Do you remember the story? Jesus walked into the temple, and what did he do? Throughout the money changers. That was a thing of the priest on up to the high priest. He was not happy with how the priest and the high priest were working in the temple, and he threw them out. He turned over the tables, and he said, "You're making this a den of robbers," as he went in there. That's what had become of the priesthood and the high priest at this time. So, coming down to the middle of that page, in Acts chapter 4, 5, 7, 9, 22, 24, and all verses in all those chapters talk about how the high priests were persecuting Christians, actively persecuting Christians, including the stoning of Stephen, I think is in maybe chapter 7 there, and so forth. Ruler after ruler, chieftain after chieftain of the Roman Empire and the Jewish nation was assassinated and ruined. Gaius, Claudius, Nero, Galba, Ortho, Vitellius, all died by murder or suicide. Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, Herod Agrippa, and most of the Herodian princes, together with not a few of the leading high priests of Jerusalem, perished in disgrace or exile or by violent hands. All of these were quenched suns and darkened stars. Again, using that star to talk about these people in high places. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Caiaphas, most people think that shortly after AD 36, when he was kicked out, committed suicide. And it's amazing to me how that kind of power engrips people so much that they don't even want to live without it. God, and we've talked several times in this class, God considered Israel His bride. His bride had been unfaithful. The leaders were unfaithful. And then it talks about the divorce of God and Israel and the new Israel being the church and so forth, and how God separates Himself from Israel, this AD 70 being kind of the last straw where it is taken out. From Herod the Great, from 40 to 4 BC, the high priests received their appointments from Rome. We talked about that. Josephus then starts writing about some of these things. When Gratus had done these things, he went back to Rome after he had tarried in Judea 11 years, when Pontius Pilate became his successor. So this Gratus guy that put Annas in as high priest was there for 11 years, and when he left, went back to Rome, that's when Pontius Pilate showed up. Pontius Pilate now is the Roman guy that's in charge of these things. Caiaphas was the official high priest at the time Luke refers to in the beginning of the public life of Jesus, but Annas still held his former title as well as considerable authority. Luke writes that Peter and John, this is what I was looking for before, remained in Jerusalem after the Pentecost in AD 33 and publicly proclaimed the gospel and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. That was in Acts chapter 3, a little earlier than what I was looking. A few of these things we want to take a look at. The next day, the rulers and elders, let me back up. The high priest was in charge of the Sanhedrin. I have a tough time wrapping my head around who Sanhedrin, Sadducees, Pharisees, all these groups of people, who's who. I know woe be the Pharisees, and some of those things I understand that Pharisees were righteous and pious and pompous and all those things. The Sanhedrin, though, that is another group of priestly leaders. The high priest was the head of the Sanhedrin, and they were leaders and made decisions for the people in as far as what priests would do and should do and so forth. Sadducees, yes.
You equate the Sanhedrin with maybe Congress, and you had two houses, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. To me, that's my mental image.
Maybe. I don't know that well. I think the Sanhedrin was separate from, there may have been Sadducees and Pharisees both in the Sanhedrin, but the Sanhedrin was a group that was a council of people under the leadership of the high priest. The high priest, Annas and Caiaphas, I think, were Sadducees. Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection. And Pharisees often did believe in the resurrection. Sadducees did not. And anyway, that's some of the difference in these. Acts 4, verse 6. The next day, the rulers and elders and the teachers of the law met in Jerusalem. Annas, the high priest, so here's one of the places is still calling Annas the high priest when actually Caiaphas was. Annas the high priest was there, and so were Caiaphas, John, Alexander, and others of the high priest family. So it's almost like a family grouping. I don't know if you call it like a mob setting or what, but on down in John, next one, John 18:12 and 13 says, "So the Roman cohort and the commander and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him, and they brought him to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year." I don't know, they rotated maybe. I don't know. I don't know how all that worked. Yeah. So when Jesus is arrested and they take him to the high priest, who's kind of the one that makes much of the political decisions for the Jews, they go to him, and he wanted Jesus out. They were not happy with some of the stuff Jesus had been doing in that last week or so, especially, but in the last 3 years to a large degree. And how are we going to get him out? Who has something against him? And it starts talking about people started making stuff up. They started lying about him. They started telling stories. And let's see if it talks about that more here. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Jesus answered him, "I have spoken openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple area where all the Jews congregate, and I said nothing in secret. Why are you asking me? Ask those who have heard what I spoke to them." Look, these people know what I said, so that's what Jesus' defense was to Annas, who's saying, what have you got to say for yourself? But when he said these things, one of the officers who was standing nearby struck Jesus, saying, "Is that the way you answer the high priest?" In other words, don't be a smart aleck to the high priest. Jesus answered him, "If I have spoken wrongly, testify of the wrong, but if rightly, why do you strike me?" So Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Right above that, it said Annas was a high priest. So that's why it's somewhat confusing. So Annas now sends him to Caiaphas. Caiaphas had a lot of authority in what was going on. It says a very interesting statement in John chapter 11, Caiaphas talking about Jesus. He said, "You know nothing, neither do you consider that it is expedient for you that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation not perish." That sentence is very, very interesting, because he's talking about Jesus and his, you're messing up the whole country. Let's cut this off. And what really happened is Jesus was cut off, but he died not only for the nation of Israel, but for all nations of all time, and that we should not perish. That is a very telling prophecy that Caiaphas came up with. A little bit more about that early on the next page. As we drop down, because we only got about 3 minutes to go, the answer Jesus gave they're talking to Jesus in his trial. "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus said, "I am. And you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Tearing his clothes, the high priest said, "What further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. How does it seem to you?" And they all condemned him as deserving of death. Mark 14. And the answer Jesus gave was a prophecy of the coming destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. You, O Caiaphas, and you chief priests and elders of the Jews, condemn me as a false Christ and blasphemer. I sit as a prisoner at your judgment seat, but I will soon come in judgment of you. You in Jerusalem have rejected God and his Messiah, and God will soon bring his terrible punishment upon you. Caiaphas ruled as high priest for 18 years, and he may well have been the one in charge of when the Sanhedrin condoned the stoning of Stephen. We've already mentioned in AD 36, the governor of Syria, Lucius Vitellius, removed both Pontius Pilate and Caiaphas from office, and then appointed Jonathan, a son of Annas, as high priest. So after Caiaphas, the next son of Annas, Jonathan, became the high priest. And goes on a little bit more about going back and forth between Caiaphas, Pilate, Herod. Pilate finally said, I'm washing my hands of him, do what you want. He's the one that said, if you want to kill him, kill him. I find nothing wrong with him. Nobody could really find anything other than what Caiaphas has said, that he says that he's going to tear down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. That was the blasphemy. Obviously, he didn't understand what was being said there, and that was kind of the reason, the one reason really that they had to crucify Jesus. Pilate, when he was talking to him, John 19:15 says, Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priest answered, we have no king but Caesar, which again shows that political point of view that the high priest had. They were political appointees. They more than priests and Jews. Right, yeah, they wanted to keep their power. And back to Revelation chapter 8, verse 10, a great star fell. And that's how that ties in to this AD 70 view of the preterist view of Revelation, and that great star being a pretty key point in there, to the point that we have, a full lesson about that. And then we go from there in verse 12 to the fourth trumpet, which is the last, like Mike was talking about, the last of the physical ones that take care of us. Any other questions, comments as we go from there? Hopefully that was somewhat understandable, a little bit of a history lesson as we move back in next week to finish up chapter 8 and chapter 9. Thank you.
Love one another, for love is of God. He who loves is born of God and knows God. He who does not love does not know God, for God is love. God is love. Love one bears all things. He who leaves all and knows God. Love holds all things. For